Hello everyone, welcome to this edition of Michael and Deborah Have a Chat with special guest Phil Twyford, Minister of Transport, MP for Te Atatu, good bloke and a very good friend of ours. So
good to see you.
Welcome along, Phil. Now I want to talk today about a particular bugbear that I've got that I think about quite a lot, and as politicians we tend to have a lot of bugbears, but here is mine. It's where people say, and sometimes it happens out there, sometimes it happens in the House as well, don't be so political, or that's just ideological. And it annoys me like crazy, because I think what it actually does is kind of diminish something about living in a democracy, which is that we're supposed to have a contest of ideas. And that's what an ideology is about. It's about having a coherent set of ideas. And so I don't do this, but whenever someone says that, I sort of want to turn around to them and say, what, so you just make things up on the spot? Because actually an ideology is about having some values and then sort of bringing together the ideas that give some structure to that and trying to build a society around that. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
I think it's a really good thing, actually. I didn't join the Labour Party just because I wanted to dabble around in politics. I actually had a whole set of values that said, actually, this is where I belong, and it aligned with it. You know.
I think it's part of the anti-intellectual tradition in New Zealand that is pretty powerful. It's part of our kind of our post-colonial history, and but it sort of pretends that politics can be reduced to common sense, and that ideas and ideology are somehow some kind of foreign thing. And what it does actually is that it both dumbs down the debate, but it also it tries to conceal the real differences of values in political ideology that should be the sort of lifeblood of political debate. And when you were saying that, Michael, I was thinking, I can remember using ideological.
I'm sure we all have, actually,
as a term of abuse from time to time, but you're right, it's quite wrong. So.
But it's just interesting because when we're out campaigning for Labour, people say, well, you should tell your Labour story. Why were you attracted to the Labour Party? And it's supposed to be a way of connecting with people. And my one is, well, I wrote a PhD. And the ideas in that. And I really am ideas driven, but somehow we're not allowed to say that. Or we are actually, but we've actually got to own it rather than...
Well, I think that, for me, the great example of a government or a kind of political generation who practiced this and really tried to conceal any sort of ideology underneath a kind of a veneer of just sort of common sense and tried to depoliticise things was the key government, actually. For the best part of 9 years, really tried to sort of suck the content out of political debate, pretend that things were, I'm comfortable with this, or it's all about striking the right balance. And actually boiling away under the surface were discussions about the role of the state, privatisation, the market, inequality, which are really the big, some of the big things about issues of our time that really, should be flushed out and debated pretty openly. So.
And there's quite a good point in there, isn't there, that it's if you're in a position of dominance, hegemony, you're in government, your ideas are holding sway in the moment, then it's quite a good line to use, isn't it? Because it's effectively saying there's no more debate, it's the end of history. It's all just kind of managing the technical aspects of how you govern, or making decisions on the spot.
Actually, I've tended to talk about it as a difference between government and management, and I don't think they were governing, I think they were managing. Right, so it was just that ongoing day-to-day pragmatism, what will work, what can we get by with, exactly what you talked about there. They would of course resist that. We're being a little unfair, and they're not here to answer to it. So.
Well, I mean, Labour has its critics who would say that we're far too close to kind of managerial politics, but I do think it is in our DNA to be reformers, to be much more interested in political debates that include values and ideology, and to grapple with some of those issues. And I think about the issues that I've been working on around urban development and transport and housing and so on. And there are some really interesting issues of ideology. So, for example, our our program in housing has been very much about reasserting the role of state housing and the state actively intervening in markets to try to get better results for people, and in a whole lot of other ways as well, like re-regulating the rental market and so on. But at the same time, sitting alongside that, it's quite also a program of reforms around infrastructure financing and allowing private investment into the infrastructure that allows our cities to grow. That's a policy that comes really from the United States originally, and is much more associated with a kind of a free market view of the world. We're also trying to reform the planning system to allow it to be more permissive, to allow our cities to grow, and that's based on the idea that when you constrain demand, you drive up prices and you actually deny people housing choices. So those are policies that are really informed by an understanding of how markets work and the economic underpinning of what you see in the housing market. So there's two, apparently contradictory impulses.
But actually, the thing is, markets do work a lot of the time, and they can work very, very well. It's just they don't give us all the solutions we need. And this is exactly, I think, what drives us a bit, is they don't give us, that they give us a very good market result, but not necessarily the social result we want. And
that's right, and I think that one of the things I think that makes, as a social democratic party, part of our character and Labour is that we are willing to use the levers that are available to the state to try to mitigate the worst effects of the market. When markets fail, we're not squeamish about intervening. But I think the challenge for us is to always make sure that our policy thinking and political thinking is underpinned by an economic analysis of markets, and so that we don't create unintended consequences. And I think the real example of that in the area that I'm working in is the planning system, town planning and so on. The great problem with it for the last generation or two in New Zealand has been that planners have been completely devoid of economics. The two disciplines haven't never really met. So planners have made all sorts of decisions that have ignored the way markets work and had terrible unintended consequences, like giving us incredibly expensive housing.
Okay.
What you're touching on there, I think, is before sort of getting to the actual ideas themselves, is I think what is sometimes perhaps a cure for what is sometimes people's fear of ideology. Because I think sometimes when you talk about someone having an ideology, you have this picture of them being utterly fixed, rigid, one track, can't consider any other perspective or new evidence. And to me, that's a doctrinaire approach, and that is, you don't want that. You can actually be someone who has an ideological worldview, who believes in certain values, who has an analysis of what the role of the state might be and how an economy should work and how that knits together. But you can still say, hey, what about those guys over there? That's quite a good idea. Let's have a think about it.
You can still be flexible and agile.
But actually, that pushes us to the other extreme. You don't want to be so flexible and agile that you lose sight of your central values either. And so there's, but this gets us to why some problems do end up with government. They are actually difficult problems to solve. If they had been solved previously elsewhere, they wouldn't end up with us trying to solve them. And that means that we do need to try to walk that difficult sort of path between having ideas and values that we hold true to, but at the same time not being so pig-headed about them that we wouldn't pick up good ideas from elsewhere. But then you don't want to just go, well, I'll just grab this from here and that from there and this from the other place, and not be able to hold them together either.
I think one of the this question of values and ideology, one of the really interesting kind of fault line of our time, and it's not so stark in New Zealand mainstream politics at the moment, but it's certainly internationally, it's everywhere, and that is the line between kind of open societies committed to kind of respect and celebrating diversity and democratic freedoms on the one hand, and societies that are becoming increasingly closed, punitive, and divided on the other, and with the rise of right-wing nationalism. So that's pretty amazing to watch, certainly on an international level. And I think one of the reasons I find it really interesting is that it actually, what you see happening is that it cuts across the 20th century left-right politics, and you're seeing in some places like Britain before our eyes, and the States to some extent, a kind of a realignment of politics around those values. So.
I sort of feel like it does and it doesn't, in that where does the attraction to these extreme but often incoherent ideologies come from? And it's generally, in my observation, a sense of alienation, a sense of being left out, of being left behind. And it's not the first time that's happened.
No, that's right.
That generally speaking, it's when there isn't a political structure that gives people some stake, that gives people some voice into the society, that you'll get the appeal of the demagogues, the extreme solutions, the people who would blame the other.
Yes, but add to that too what we know from some social science research and the like, that some of us are quite happy living reasonably flexibly, or we can change, we're open to change. Other people really do prefer a very structured society, and it wouldn't matter which way it was structured as long as it had structure and they knew their place and they knew the rules around it. So it is the left behind analysis, but also the needs of people to feel secure. And for some people, having a changing world is so threatening to their security that they're looking for that strength somewhere, and that's why the attraction to strongman leaders, I think.
So what I think is interesting about that as well, which is that historically it's been our foes on the other side of politics who have been the political force which has stood for continuity, stability, keeping things as they are, the value of traditions, and stable communities. As the political right over a period of 30 or 40 years has drifted towards a free market analysis and policy mix, they're actually the ones who have sort of walked away from that to the turbulence, the hurricane of the free market, jobs, communities uprooted. I actually think there's a space for the left to actually be the ones that actually say we actually recognise the value of there being some stability and some continuity in people's lives. It's not to say we can hold back the winds of change and globalisation, but how do you sort of reconstruct that in an uncertain world?
Well, I think that loops us back to kind of where we started almost, and that's the relationship between the citizen and the state. And I think that the great opportunity for centre-left parties around the world is to kind of rediscover this kind of willingness to use the power of the state to protect people from the kind of destructive instability of market economies, and try to get the best from market economies, but also give people this sort of security and the opportunity that they crave. And also, the other interesting question is, in doing that, how close can centre-left parties get to a political language of the nation and of the nation state, which is sort of under attack, but also under resurgence as well around the world. And my personal view is that the left has to be willing to do that, and because I think the language of the nation, it doesn't have to be reactionary nationalism, but the nation and the state still is a structure that actually can offer people a lot of security and protection in the modern world.
I mean, my experience in both local government then as an MP is that people do want something bigger to be part of. And they derive a sense of pride and identity. And there's often sort of my local community or suburb, and people get really kind of protective and proud of that. But I think you're right, Phil. It does go beyond that. Nation states didn't just sort of spring out of the ether for no reason.
But on the left, I think often in our political tradition, we've been a bit queasy about the language of nationalism or the nation, and have seen it as the preserve of the reactionary right, and we've been kind of uncomfortable with that. And I kind of think, we've got to get over it, because it's actually a powerful form of political language that really does connect with people.
It's also ironic in that pretty much, well, to a large degree, most of the significant political achievements of the left over the last 150 years have been achieved through the instruments of the nation state.
Exactly.
So
we are also multilateralists, there's good stuff we do there. We love the UN,
But we do this a lot in New Zealand. We talk about our diversities and our diverse communities and how we're all part of New Zealand. So we've got a whole set of language around that we're using. And we do talk, and particularly since March 15, talk about all of us being New Zealanders. Lots of different ways of being a New Zealander, but we are, all New Zealanders are, a Muslim New Zealander, a Chinese New Zealander, a whatever else. I've got to lose the words now. But and I think that's quite important to us, saying we're all in this together, and there's a way for all of us, however different we are, all to belong together.
I think it's also New Zealanders have a sort of a level of comfort with the state and a level of trust, and that is that's kind of an opportunity and a good thing for centre-left politics, because there are many places around the world where in the States, the progressive movement there, they tend to always see the government as the problem, never the solution. And there's lots of other places where people, because of history and culture, people are, have for various reasons are suspicious and hostile to the state, and but it's kind of a little bit of a rallying point for New Zealanders. When there's a problem, our first instinct is to think, the government should probably fix this.
And
so
earthquake, natural disasters, ACC, GFC. There was an expectation that the state would play a major role. Just on that issue of sort of people's sometimes distrust of the state and the reasons they don't like it, there are also legitimate reasons for that, it seems to me. It can sometimes be bureaucratic, monolithic, insensitive to local needs. And I've just, subtly somewhere in my bookshelf, finished Max Rashbrook's book, which is called Government for the Public Good, from memory. And he sort of proposes an evolution of the state to try and deal with those issues, and he's someone who does propose an important role for the state, and he calls it liquid government, the idea of government that is there, that is active, but that isn't so monolithic, that might engage with citizens more at the community level, that might involve them more in decision making, for example through citizens' juries and this kind of thing. Do you think there's something in that?
I do. I mean, I think that over the last 20 or 30 years, and you think about third way Labour politics in the 80s, there was this fashion for partnerships and the state devolving to community organisations, and actually there's a lot of good in that, and the state can do that, and it can engage with civil society and around delivery of services and all of those things. But and I kind of think for our generation, the job is to kind of bank that progress and those good ideas. It's part of what we do now in the modern world. But the thing for us really is to kind of relearn a much more muscular way of the state interacting with the market, and a willingness to intervene when the market fails, a willingness to shift the goalposts to make sure that the people who really need help get it, a willingness to regulate for fairness. And I think our government's doing that in a whole lot of areas right now, whether it's the environment, whether it's mental health services, whether it's the housing market, you name it. We are willing for the state to really work in a different way, and actually one of the challenges is trying to make sure that the machinery of government and the public service are able to do that, because they've been quite constrained in their role. They've been pushed back into a sort of being policy advisors, and the government doesn't have capability in a lot of areas, and we have to rebuild it.
Absolutely.
Good task to be engaged in.
It is. Hey, well look, that probably is a good note for us to end. I think a really good summary perhaps of despite the fact that different people have slightly different takes on the world of, broadly speaking, the values and the ideology that we hold on to as social democrats. So thank you, Phil.
Yes.
Pleasure.
We'll get out there and do it, eh?
Excellent. Let's do
this.
Okay. Thanks everyone.